Good evening, everyone. I'm Johan Tysk, the Dean of the Faculty of Science and Technology, and it is a distinct pleasure for me to welcome you all to Professor Keri Facer's lecture tonight. But before giving the word to our climate change leadership professor, I would like to hand over the mic to Sanna Berno. She's currently at the Climate Change Leadership Initiative. Yeah. So Sanna, here is the microphone.
Thank you very much. Welcome everybody to the lecture. My name is Sanna Berno and I'm one of the project leaders for the Climate Change Leadership Initiative, which is a 10-year series of visiting guest professors funded by the Zennström Philanthropies, and we're very happy to have Nicholas and Catherine here tonight as guests. Just want to let everyone know that we're filming this event tonight on a live stream, and to say hello to folks in Gotland and in other places in the world who are with us tonight. Keri Facer is our third visiting Zennström Professor. She's here with us from University of Bristol, and she's a professor in social and educational futures. And we're very excited for your talk tonight, Keri, about rethinking the university in an era of climate change. Very welcome.
Thank you. So, good evening. Uppsala's managed to do what neither of my previous universities where I've been a professor has achieved, which is to get me to do an inaugural lecture. I usually manage to avoid it, but not this time. And not this time because I really feel like there is something important to say. I feel like we're really at a critical moment where we need to think about how we are going to address the challenges of climate change and the significant role that universities can play. But one of the things that we do in an inaugural in the UK is we start off by saying thank you. And I want to say thank you. I want to say thank you to Zennström Philanthropies for supporting my chair, but supporting the wider initiative. It's very unusual to have really considered, careful philanthropy that is also really hands-off. So you're fabulous. Thank you very much for your time and your commitment and your support. I want to say thank you to Leila and Sanna, who have been fabulous collaborators over the last few months and really made my life much easier. And thank you to CEMAS and to the university and to the city. You have welcomed me so generously, and it is really wonderful to be here. I also want to say thank you to one person who can't be here this evening, and she may be watching online, and that's Pernilla Glazer, who is a fabulous friend and a very important person. So, to start, I'm actually going to set my timer as well, because if I don't do that, we're here all evening, and none of us want that. So, just... Yeah, good plan. Okay, so to start, this is where I'm from. This is a little village in the north of England. It's called Rayno, and it overlooks a plain, Cheshire Plain, where a huge amount has happened over history. We have Manchester to the north, the land, the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution, a place that's kick-started some of the things that we've been talking about here. It also a land with Jodrell Bank, one of the first great radio telescopes, and it was a shape on the horizon that I grew up looking at as a child. And the town that I live in, Rayno, the little one at the bottom there, well, it's the town I grew up in, I don't live there anymore. Just a short distance from it is Whaley Bridge. And this is a town where in July this year, 6,000 people were evacuated from their homes overnight. They were told to leave, they were told to take their possessions, not to take their possessions, not to take their pets, and to move. And the reason they were told to move was because of this. Because there had been so much rain for several weeks that the dam collapsed. And if you look at this image, you'll see what happens. The dam, this is interesting. The dam risked flooding the entire town. So that was what happened in July this year. Just a little bit further away is Saddleworth Moor. And Saddleworth Moor last year was on fire. This is a land that I've walked through many, many times. And it's a land where the peat bogs were blazing. So just in this tiny little corner of the world, in a place that seems quite inconspicuous, we can see the signs of what it means to be living with climate change. And we can see the signs that we're living on what Amitav Ghosh calls a lively planet. And Ghosh, in his most amazing book, wonderful book called The Great Derangement, says, the humans of the future will surely understand, knowing what they presumably will know about the history of their forebears on Earth, that only in one very brief era, lasting less than 3 centuries, did a significant number of their kind believe that planets are inert. Where we are today is we're at a point of recognizing what it means to live on a lively planet. We're realizing that our industrial European ideas of mastery and control may have their limits. We are no longer the gods at the center of things. The ground beneath our feet is not inert but alive. We're living with what Zoe Todd and the Inuit calls Sila, or what James Lovelock calls Gaia. And what this means is effectively a civilizational shift, and it's a shift, as Bruno Latour argues, that is as significant as the shift from Ptolemaic to Copernican theory of the universe. So it's a shift from that idea that we're on a planet that the world circulates around us to the idea that we are circulating around the sun. That's when we realized we were not the center of the universe. Today we are relearning that the planet is not inert but alive, and that we're part of a rich, complex system of which we are simply one part. Now, the social theorists and the climate scientists and others are getting there, but arguably the artists got there first. Look at this image from Van Gogh, his image, The Wheat Field. This is a vibrant, living world. It's humming with life. So before I go on and talk about the university, what I'd like us to do is to just take a moment to think about what it means to be part of a lively planet. And I want to give you some little help to do this. I want you to just have a look at this and think about what it means to live on a lively planet, to have all these things going on at the same time. When did you last get a feeling that you were part of a lively planet that was bigger than you? What did you feel? So what on earth does all of this mean for the university? Okay? We're in this space. There are multiple beings that we are part of. What does this mean for the university? Well, I think it's worth realizing the university works on different timescales, and there are clearly immediate and urgent challenges that we face to this recognition. We have new and urgent responsibilities. We need to decarbonize, we need to steward our land and buildings, we need to create space for food, we need to attend to our waste. We are a material practice as a university. And the amazing work of the climate students, the no-fly movement and fossil free are already working in that area. But at the same time, the thing that slightly worries me is a language of fixing climate change risks fooling us, even while we act, that nothing has changed in our world. That if we just get the engineering and the economics right, then things can carry on as they always have been. The idea that if we all stop flying, it will be fine. As though the land has not shifted, as though the land is not always shifting beneath our feet. So I think if we recognize this, this means that in universities we also need to think for the long term. And we need to recognize the role of research and education in enabling the civilizational shift. We need, as Martin Shaw argues, to ask the foundational cultural questions, to play the long game with climate change, to reveal the understory to all of this. Or, as Amitav Ghosh argues, the climate crisis is also a crisis of culture, and thus of the imagination. So that longer game is also what I want to talk about today, because universities are uniquely capable of supporting civilizational change. Now, obviously, we're not the only ones talking about all of this. The debate about how to live on a lively planet is also on the streets. Hands up, who knows who these are? Yay! So these are the Gilets jaunes. I first came across them last November. I was getting the train from France up here and was approaching the train station, and suddenly I couldn't get anywhere because the roundabout in front of the train station was full of Gilets jaunes who were pointing out to us the unfairness of the taxation that was being proposed by Macron's government. Then this summer, this is the sort of thing that you come across. This happens all the time in Bristol. This is my hometown, Bristol, now. And it's always this sunny. Always, never rains in Bristol. So this is the Extinction Rebellion protest. And they're arguing for different things. They're arguing for a citizens' assembly. They're arguing for urgent government action. So when we pay attention to that, we realize that learning to live with a lively planet isn't just a question of science. There are serious and reasonable debates and tensions emerging about how to respond. There are tensions between the 10% who are producing 50% of the emissions and the 90% of the rest, between the urban and the rural, between top-down and bottom-up, between market and state. So if we're interested in restoring climate, and I think we should be thinking about restoring climate, we also need to think about reviving democracy. How do we create conditions in which different voices are heard so that we can negotiate? And how do we rethink economics? How do we rebalance our economic system so that it works for people and planet? These are non-trivial questions. And learning is required. We're going to have to learn, and learn rapidly. Now, one of the things that's worth noticing is the extent to which these protests are also educational interventions. Pretty much every protest these days starts off with the setting up of an educational space. So the Occupy movement sets up the Occupy University and the Occupy Library. These were pictures from Extinction Rebellion this summer. This is the Read-In and Learning Pagoda, but there are also loads of other workshops going on around. This is also something I never thought I'd see in my hometown, which is a middle-class white guy explaining how to lock yourself to another middle-class white person in order to make it harder for the police to arrest you. So there are some interesting learning processes going on. And critically, what we need to bear in mind here is that controversy is an educational moment. Callon and colleagues have talked about this in detail here in this book. So controversy is a moment that stimulates a desire for information, a search for solutions, a marshalling of evidence. It brings in new voices and experiences, and it pluralizes debate. Let's just have a look at what happened at Standing Rock. So at Standing Rock, which was the protest against the Dakota oil pipeline, there were 10,000 people that arrived, so many people that they had to have a new postcode. And there were thousands more online. And as Tom Goldtooth explained at the Earth Rights Conference this year, this was a profoundly educational moment. The protest involved learning around pipelines, around corrosion, around the economics of oil sales. And it also generated new realities. We saw a real drive and growth in the Earth Rights movement and the relighting of the sacred flame of the councils. But away from the front lines, we're also seeing new educational practices and institutions emerging. And these institutions are asking really challenging questions. They're asking, how do we regenerate culture? What sorts of ways of living and being are required if we see ourselves as part of a rich living world, as one being in a space of beings? What sorts of rituals and practices and relationships are needed? So we have places like Highland Lake Cove in the US, which is inviting anybody to weekly supper nights, to running conversations that matter. We've got Ubiquity University, a new institution that is promising an education to address these issues on head and heart and hand is what they're promising, which is about building knowledge and self-knowledge and action towards the Sustainable Development Goals. Here in Sweden, we have the International Youth Initiative Programme, which is a year-long programme for young people, which is about building their capacity to confront wider global challenges. We also have groups like the Ecoversities Network. This is a network now that first met, this was 2015, the first gathering, that is networking up really significant numbers of emerging grassroots universities that are locating their educational offer around the land, around the self. And what's noticeable is that these institutions, they are recruiting young people and adults who are brought together by a sense of concern for the future and who are willing to pay for this, who are willing to participate in these activities without the promise of a certificate or a job or anything else in return. Now, those of us who work in educational history know that these sorts of institutions are an indicator of civilizational change. They spring up like mushrooms overnight. They get to grip with composting the old civilization. And the ones that we're seeing now are following in a long tradition. They're following in the tradition of the coffee houses of the 17th century, where people got together to talk about things that they couldn't talk about anywhere else. They're following in the tradition of the royal societies and the academies, who started getting together because, frankly, the universities weren't doing the job that they needed to. They follow in the tradition of the cooperative houses and the popular universities of Europe and America at the turn of the century, or the workshops set up at the end of the Civil War to support freed enslaved peoples. They're following in the tradition of the Freirian popular education movement and the University de la Tierra in Oaxaca. They're following in the tradition of Gandhi's workshops that were set up to build Indian culture and to resist colonization. And they're following in the tradition of the folk high schools of Scandinavia that was set up to develop new educational approaches in conditions of urbanization and industrialization. So the reason I'm asking us to pay attention to these groups is because seemingly alternative educational institutions are often seedbeds of significant change. And what they do is they warn us of what is missing in dominant educational monocultures. And they warn us today that we have an education system that is oriented towards one particular future of endless economic growth, and that values only one sort of knowledge, cognitive Western knowledge. So what sorts of knowledge is missing that these organizations today are pointing to? They are pointing to what we call, in popular education movements, conscientization. So a knowledge that helps you work on what is going wrong in the world. So if I think about one of these ecoversities, Tomera, the eco-village, it's a place in Portugal, it's astonishing. You arrive there through literally desert in Portugal. It's a barren, destroyed landscape. You arrive, and through a gate, you enter into a space that is green and beautiful, where they have figured out how to work with water and land in a way that is seriously sustainable. So these organizations are working on the issues that are really facing us in terms of the difficulties in the world. But they're also working on the self. They're supporting people to think about who they are, what their relationship to the world is, what they love, what they deny, what moves us. They're working on relational knowledge. They're helping people understand their relations to each other, to the networks, and to the world that they're a part of. And they're also working on temporal knowledge, which is something that I am particularly concerned with. And I'm going to give us a little bit of time to think about this. What they're doing is they're allowing us to work out, what does it mean to live in a time of critical uncertainty and still have the capacity to act? Oh. Now let's pause on that for a second. One of the things that's happening, not only outside universities, but inside them, is a renewed interest in how we live with different conceptions of time. A field that I've been involved with the last 5 to 6 years is a field called anticipation studies. And it's trying to pull together all the expertise across different disciplines that help us think about how we think about the future. And this is particularly important when we're thinking about paying attention to the question of what does it mean to live with a lively planet. Because living with a lively planet, living with climate change, brings a new conception of time. It requires us to think about deep time, to think about deep geology, as well as long-term futures. It requires us to think about complex time, about tipping points, about reversals, about unintended consequences. It requires us to think about the limits of clock time not as a space that we want to live in all the time, but as only one of the different temporalities that exist. And importantly, what these projects are doing outside the university is that they're helping us think about how do you produce certainty in the midst of uncertainty? How do you produce confidence in the midst of the possibility of radical reversals? And here they're talking about the development of relationality, of commitments, of promises. Think about the decision to get married. The decision to get married is a crazy decision in so many ways, but it's a promise. It's a commitment taken in the midst of radical uncertainty about what will happen, that you will maintain relationships with each other. So what is coming out of this is the awareness that living on a lively planet demands that we recognize our limited capacity to see and to know the future at the same time as our limitless capacity to care for it. So, quick recap, ladies and gentlemen. My screen is busy giving you a preview. Living with a lively planet is giving us, if we look at the things that these organizations and groups are drawing our attention to, they're drawing our attention to 4 levels of the issue. Firstly, to the issue of restoring climate. Now, these levels are produced by Sahaya Neotula, who's one of the great futurists who works with a process called causal layered analysis. And this, it seems to me, is the level of analysis that we need here. So he's suggesting at the top level, we've got the litany level, the headline level, is the challenge of restoring climate. At the next level, at the structural level, we have the challenge of reviving democracy and rethinking economics. At the worldview level, we have the issue of how do we rethink time and agency? How do we build the capacity to act in a complex system? And finally, at the mythical level, we've got the question of how we regenerate culture. How do we develop new conceptions of ourselves? So, how should universities respond? What I'd like you to do is just take a second and see if you can talk to somebody you have not already talked to today, and just see what you think the answer to that question is. Because the reality is we're working in an experimental space here. So I'm going to be making propositions, but I will also recognize very clearly there will be many, many different models that we adopt as we are trying to move into a new civilization. Right, so 2 minutes, talk to somebody else. What do you think the answer to that question is? How should universities respond to this civilizational shift? Bloody slides. Okay, come back. This is always such a bad idea, getting people to start talking, and then I have to stop you, and I'm sorry. And you're just going to have to carry on talking to this person that you've just met now, aren't you? You're just going to have to keep talking to them after this, which is excellent, because that's the point of coming out, isn't it? It's to make connections and to build new conversations. Okay, so you all have ideas quite clearly. I'm in a room of people who have ideas, which is slightly daunting, but it'll be okay. Right, So, how should universities respond? I'm going to take us on a slight sidetrack. And the sidetrack that I want to take us on, the only point of the conversations that I'm going to give right now, is to make the point that universities can change. Right? They can. It's very hard to believe it sometimes, but it is actually possible. Right, so let's start. Imagine yourselves in 13th century Paris. Just think about how hard it is to imagine yourself in Paris without the Eiffel Tower. The Eiffel Tower is not there, okay? So you are in 13th century Paris. And the 13th century university in Paris was an interesting place. They were concerned with the same sorts of things that Extinction Rebellion are concerned with. They were concerned with life and death. They were concerned with the life of the soul. So they were places that were educating the clergy. And what happened every year, or so, a couple of times a year, was they had these things called quadlibets. And a quadlibet was when any member of the university, so the clergy who are out in the fields, could come into the university and ask any question of any professor. Don't you think we should do that now? I think it would be brilliant. We should do that sort of thing. Anyway, so they did that. And they would come in. And now the problem is around the 13th century, they started to have a bit of a problem because this thing called merchant time arrives. And what merchant time does is it says that time can equate to money. Okay. So this starts generating all sorts of problems for the university. So the clergyman is coming in and he says to the professor, I've got a woman who wants to rent out her land for a lifelong annuity, all right? So she's going to rent it out to a peasant for a certain amount for a very long time. Is she going to burn in hell, is basically the question that they're asking. Because if she makes a profit, she is committing usury. And if she is committing usury, she is committing a sin. So it's all very bad. Now this sounds obscure, but it causes all sorts of problems in the university because the question it raises is, well, who can tell the future? Because you can only work out if she's going to make a profit if you know how long she's going to live. Problem. So the university's like, well, we can't answer that because only God knows the future. So Thomas Aquinas gets involved. Thomas Aquinas, he brings in the big guns, and Thomas Aquinas says, no, it's okay, because only God can know the future, but you know what? The medics and the astrologers, they can understand cause and effect. So they can say what might lead to something else. And so we can let them say that they can give advice in this sort of situation. So my point here is that what happens outside the university there is a change in the idea of time and a question that's brought to the university. And the university does not respond by setting up a little course in merchant time that a certain number of people are going to pick up. They completely reorganize the curriculum, the knowledge, the sense of what knowledge counts. And it's not the only time that this sort of change happens. Let's think about the Enlightenment. What we've got going on in this period is we've got a mass democratization of knowledge. We've got publications going on, we've got the Royal Academies, we've got people generating new ideas. And at this point, the university is seen basically as a place for drunk students and the reading of old books. So the university is seen as a bit of a problem. Okay, so what do? Do we shut down the university is the question? No. We invent a completely new university. And we do this through this mechanism of the discipline. We invent disciplines. And the discipline is the thing that says, don't worry, you don't have to worry about all of this information, you focus in. And if you focus in, it will tell you what knowledge is important, what it is that you need to pay attention to. So the research university gets invented as effectively a living encyclopedia. And it leads to two really significant shifts. And the first one is spatial. And what it does is it says that the university now identifies itself first with the discipline rather than with the state or the church. And in order for that to work, it has to undermine all the other sort of knowledge that could be not associated with the church or the state. What it does is it leads to the radical exclusion from universities of any knowledge that does not fit within the disciplines as we know them. So women's knowledge, everyday knowledge, the knowledge of the Ottoman Empire, which had previously been hugely rich, all of that is seen in Kant's terms as manifestly inferior. Now, what this does is it gives huge benefits in terms of technical specialization. but it also means a massive loss of other sorts of knowledge. And at the same time, this change gets allied to colonial and to nation-building projects, which leads to, as de Souza Santos says, epistemicide, so the killing of other forms of knowledge. The other shift that emerges is temporal. What happens when you get a commitment to disciplines is you say, our job is not to deal with what's going on at the moment. Our job is to be accountable to our discipline over the long term. So what does this instance of the 13th century university and the Enlightenment university tell us about universities and tell us that's important for our thinking today? They tell us first that universities can and do change, that such changes have been fundamental, that they've involved a significant reorganization in thinking about what knowledge matters and whose knowledge matter, that there are always struggles for power. I've put often, it's not often. There's always struggles for power as well as for knowledge, and that the university has never been just one thing, but many. And the other thing that this tells me, with my interest in how we think about the future, is that the history of the university shows us that though we have in our institutions an astonishing legacy of different approaches for responding to the question, how do we build better futures? So the ancient universities give us the inquiry into ancient knowledge. The Enlightenment universities give us discovery. They give us the idea that we can observe the world and understand the futures that are in progress. They give us experimentation, the idea of prompting the world into being. The 19th century civic universities that I've not talked about give us the idea of praxis, the idea that we can co-make the world between the university and community. The Marxist traditions that emerge gives us the idea that we can challenge the ideas of the future that are being presented. And the 20th century gives us the incredible tools of modeling, the tools to be able to construct images of the future. But this history of the university also gives us absences that are a real problem for what we're thinking about today in terms of living with a lively planet. There is no space within them for lived experience, for embodied experience, for knowledge that's connected to and part of the cycles of the land. There are no practices of care, of maintenance, of repair for the world. We're always searching for something new. And there are no processes for deep reflexivity on the self. So, that's where we are. So can we reinvent the university for life on a lively planet? Is this possible? Well, it's worth remembering there's no such thing as a university. There isn't. They're all different. There are 25,000 of them around the world, and they range from, if anybody's been to Boston, you just see the most either side of this huge river. Along the side, there are these astonishing, enormous buildings, you know, this kind of megalopolis of university power and control. And yet at other times, we've got universities that are tiny little organizations, very, very different, very accountable to different people. So that's the first thing that we need to think about. The second thing, though, is that universities may be part of the climate change problem. So we know that climate scientists have played a significant role alongside indigenous scholars in raising and defining the problem. But in reality, these more accurate models have not shifted the debate. I mean, you know, the knowledge is not enough on its own. At the same time, universities have continued to become significant drivers of high levels of emissions. Those individuals have been trying to create space in universities for discussions around sustainability, have been systematically marginalized. And there is a question about whether the more a university talks about sustainability, the less funding it actually gives to that work. And increasingly, education has also coincided with a great acceleration. So those of you who know the great acceleration graphs, the massive increase in water use, in population, in exploitation of the environment, that's matched by the massive increase in people going to university. So we have become more educated, but not perhaps more wise. At the same time, we have a shift today to the university that sees itself primarily as a business. Now, I am not saying there is no space for working with industry, but what I am saying is that a university is not primarily a business. And today we can see vice-chancellors. This is a lot worse in the Anglo-Saxon universities, by the way. I'm giving you a heads up, so keep an eye out here in Sweden. But there are many vice-chancellors who call themselves CEOs. There are boards stuffed with interests from the city. They are deeply interconnected with fossil fuel industries. There are universities in Canada, for example, where the mining industry is helping to write all of the mining curriculum and will not hear any criticism or any critique of those initiatives. We've got universities in New Zealand who make more money from selling sports clothes than they do from any other activity. And at the same time, governments are not helping it. Governments are presenting universities as a kind of business sector, and that the job is for universities to generate international student income. At the same time, universities, there are patterns of inequality that are increasing. High income, highly educated individuals in Sweden, for example, are much more likely to have highly educated children. The patterns are reproducing. So we need to stop with the rose-tinted glasses, okay? Because quite often when we're talking about universities and possibilities for the future, we tend to sort of treat them as these kind of idealized things. They're not ideal. They're messy, they're flawed, they're complicated, they have profound absences, and that is why these alternative education spaces are emerging. But universities matter. They matter hugely. They have huge material and economic impact. In Sweden, they employ 28% of all government workers. They educated 45% of the population. 245,000 students start last year, and they own and manage significant land assets. And the idea of a university is still important. The idea of a university, a space that seeks wisdom and can be trusted to educate the next generation, is still alive. And you can tell this because there are dictators trying to shut them down. We won't go there. We'll manage to get through a speech without saying that. At the same time, scientists and professors are still more highly trusted than politicians and journalists. So it is worth it thinking about how the university can be renewed. So I'm going to make some proposals. And I'm going to make some proposals inspired by this sort of picture. So this is the Hundertwasser House in Vienna, for those of you who don't know it. This was a brilliant artist and visionary architect, and he built these amazing houses that had rooms for trees. So there's like rooms set aside with large amounts of soil in them and a tree that will grow out of the window. Now, critically, what he was able to do was to make the best use of that space and increase the biodiversity on that space. So this particular building has 250 trees and bushes associated with it, as well as 53 apartments and 4 offices. So, inspired by the spirit of Hundertwasser, I'm going to make some proposals. So, this is what we need to do. Oh, hello. I'm going to make them quickly, apparently, according to my slides. At the litany level, how do we restore the climate? Okay, we need to think about the issues of the material. The university is a material institution. At the structural level, we're thinking about democracy and economics. And here we think about the university as a public institution. At the level of worldview, we're thinking about how we reimagine our ideas of time and agency. And at that point, we're asking questions about what knowledge matters. And at the level of myth, the fundamental level, we're asking how do we regenerate culture? And to address this, we're thinking about how do we support the person? What sort of persons and what sort of people are we educating? So, at the litany level, how can universities help to restore climate? Well, it's actually not that complicated. We just need to get on with it. There is a huge amount of work going on all around the world. Brilliant work in terms of campus design. University of Austin involved in rewilding. University of Oberlin committed to zero carbon by 2020. Just let that sink in a little bit and compare with most universities, but that's what they're aiming for. This is their solar array. There are universities in the UK aiming at really committing to using their land for serious carbon sinks and offsetting, which in the UK, the universities own more land than kind of the Queen. I know it's not the same here, but so we need to work on them. They're rethinking their approaches to transport. So any university transport devices are all electrical. We've got a shift towards slow travel for academics, train-based conferences, green travel incentives. And people are thinking about food. So Queen Mary's in the UK just shifted to a completely vegetarian diet. Massachusetts University has a fantastic permaculture campus. So the place is just full of permaculture gardens. And we also need to think about teaching and think teaching differently. The drive to the internationalization of teaching doesn't have to mean shifting loads of students onto aeroplanes. And I say this having spoken to one of my PhD students last year, who's been in Bristol for 4 years and has flown to San Francisco and back 5 times a year, every year, with her boyfriend doing the reverse during that period without even thinking about it. So we need different approaches to remote teaching. And this middle image, which is, you can't see very well, this is a brilliant thing. UCL is experimenting with hologram lecturers. And holograms, come on people, this is cool. We need holograms. So they have hologram lecturers. I want a hologram lecturer, okay? I want to be a hologram lecturer. Anyway, so there is exciting things that can be done here as well. This little device at the bottom here is a remote telepresence device that's been developed. You can 3D print that thing, and then you stick your phone in it, and anybody who's not around can remote control it so that they can be part of the meeting. So the reality is there is a huge amount that can be done, should be done. We need to just get on with it. I'm not entirely sure why we're not. And to give you a feeling for this, the US has this fantastic President's Climate Leadership Commitment. There are hundreds of signatories, and they commit to 2 things. One of them is reducing emissions, and secondly, building resilience in communities in relation to adaptation. This second one, we need to think about more here as well. So that's at the litany level. At the structural level, how can we as universities help to revive democracy and rethink economics? And here it's a time for us to return to recognizing the role of the university as a public organization. So let's have a think. Sustainable university economics. How do we think about the university as an economic entity? Well, there are some fantastic models that we can pull off a shelf and work with. The Commonwealth approach in Preston and Cleveland views the university as an anchor organization that has to make intelligent choices in its procurement and its purchasing. At the same time, we've got universities trying to develop new relationships between staff and students. So we have the emergence, Joss Wynne, Mike Neary, and the Cooperative College in the UK are looking to examples like Mondragon in France to set up a cooperative university co-owned by students and staff and the community. There are also really interesting models emerging of crowdfunding independent academics. Now, the reason it's worth thinking about these economic structures is because they potentially allow the university to play a powerful role as a public platform. And this is where we start to see a shift towards thinking about research and learning as potentially, think about, do you remember the Dakota pipeline debate? You remember all the energy that's going on there? What would happen if we could combine that energy with the knowledge and the expertise and the ideas of students and master students and staff in the academy to create joint projects together? So really think, what could we achieve if we were able to connect these different sets of skills? Now, we're starting to see people trying to gesture towards this. University of Chalmers has their challenge labs, which if you've not seen, you really should play with. CMUS here in Uppsala has their student climate change leadership course. Many education for sustainable development programs are beginning to work in this way. How many of you know about science shops? Anybody got science shops? So science shops are anybody in the community can come to the university to raise a question and say, this is a problem or an issue that I want to work on. How can you help us? It's like a contemporary quad libet. And then these images are from a program that I ran in the UK for 6 years called Connected Communities that was about building relationships and partnerships between universities and communities. And this was, these are some images just from Sunday from a project from our collaboration with the Art Museum here in Uppsala with the non-human animal exhibition, which if you've not seen, please go, it's brilliant. This was an initiative where we were exploring the relationship between biodiversity and the city. We brought together scientists, we brought together the artists, community members and local politicians to begin to map the issues and to have a debate. And all sorts of things come out just from this one activity. So there are prompts to new research, to new inquiries. This sort of engagement is not the end of scholarship. It's really funny. I realized when I got here a while ago, I used to talk about university community engagement, and people looked at me and went, "Are you an activist?" So it's like the worst thing in the world. I was like, yeah, no, I'm a researcher. I just believe in listening to other people as I'm generating research ideas. So this generated a whole set of proposals that have come out just from that one activity. So, third level, worldview level. How can universities help build agency in an era of uncertainty? And this is a question of knowledge. As we've already said, living with a lively planet means living with ideas of time that are not based on old ideas of modernity and progress, but that acknowledge complexity and uncertainty and emergence. Now, the problem is as soon as we recognize complexity, there are a number of different reactions. One of them is apathy. Oh, well, if it's complicated, I'm just going to go over here and, make some eggs. Or alternatively, there's those people who say, it's really, really complicated. I'll build a bigger computer. Okay, I will get more data. Give me more data, and then I will be able to tell you exactly what is going to happen. These people always remind me of Douglas Adams stories. And anybody read Douglas Adams here? Please nod at me. Yeah, excellent. There are some people. If you haven't read Douglas Adams, can I just encourage Douglas Adams? That will explain that particular statement. But the other risk of people's response to complexity is totalitarianism, which is the world is too complicated, I know where I want it to go, and I will make it happen, and I will make the world fit in to my vision of the future. So none of these are good. So we need different ways of thinking about time and change and our relationship to it. And here I want to introduce you to the Portuguese man of war. This, ladies and gentlemen, is not a jellyfish. This is an organism that is made up of hundreds of different organisms that together create something else. And it's quite a useful explanation of the idea of symbiosis. And symbiosis is, I think, where we want to be using as a governing metaphor for our thinking about time and change. Because symbiosis is about putting together different things to create something new, something that couldn't have been imagined before. As Deborah Osberg says, it opens radically new ways of being together that take us beyond the imagined possible. Now, what are the conditions for symbiosis that we can create in a university? Well, we need to start not from a position that we know what our discipline can offer, that we will then apply to everybody else, but actually from a position of vulnerability. What are the gaps in my knowledge? What are the things that I don't know about? How can I connect with you? We need conditions that encourage improvisation and emergence and play. The opposite of the way in which we design education to hit quality standards, which is where we decide in advance what people will learn and try to make sure that we do not deviate from it at any cost. Other conditions for symbiosis are about staying with the trouble, staying with what is difficult. And fundamentally, it's about walking backwards into the future. So instead of this idea that the future is out here and it's all mapped out and our job is just to plot the best way forwards, we need to recognize that we walk backwards, we work together, we pay attention to what is emerging, and we try to make that good. So I really want one of these. I want a new faculty for symbiosis, okay? That's what I want. I think we really need to push, because, we've had people talking about interdisciplinarity, transdisciplinarity, multidisciplinarity for many, many years and arguing about it. There's lots of papers about that. But we need a faculty for symbiosis that really understands how you collide different sorts of knowledge together, how we support people to become vulnerable and to create conversations. And imagine this as a space where all students get to participate for a whole year, all right? Where you get the engineer who knows how to design and invent things, working with the historian who understands some of the history of this stuff, working with the come up with another discipline, have lost it entirely in my head. So let's imagine an artist who can think about the science fiction that might inspire new ideas, or the biologist who's concerned with stewardship. Many of the problems that we have in the world, you could argue, are because we have students that are incredibly good within their discipline. So we have people who are able to invent but aren't able to look after things, or people who are able to point out the problems but aren't able to make new stuff happen. And so this is something that I hope we're going to be exploring over the next year with colleagues in Gotland, although if there's people in Uppsala, then always ready to play. And at the final level, at the mythic level, we need to be asking, how can universities help to regenerate culture? How can they create new understandings of our place in and as part of a lively planet? And here we think about the person. None of the things that I've suggested already, I think, matter if we still work on the assumption that we as individuals are rational, autonomous, modernist individuals in full charge of our destiny. We need to dismantle this anthropocentric narcissism, and we need to rebuild a new sense of self as part of a rich and complex world. We need to recognize that the self is a process in a world of processes. Now, some of the ways in which this is being developed outside the world include things like wilderness quests, literally taking people and leaving them for 4 days in the middle of a mountain with no food to see how they confront the wider world. But we're also seeing the emergence of arts practice, meditation traditions. We've also got the important work of Vanessa Andreotti and her colleagues on gesturing towards decolonial futures. And what they're doing here is they're supporting people to address the emotions of realizing that you really are interconnected with a lot of the imperfections of the world. There are 2 things that they ask you to do to start off with. Recognize your carbon footprint and recognize your slavery footprint. So decentering the self is the first part of the work, but we also need to rebuild the sense of self in the world. We need new stories to remind us that we're not either fully irrelevant or fully powerful. And here, the deep old myths that we've forgotten may play a role. And I'm thinking here of the work of people like Martin Shaw, who as mythologist and storyteller reminds us of the role of myth and storytelling for allowing us to see our part in a much bigger, much longer, much deeper history. And as Shaw argues, when a society has no mythological anchor, no soul-affirming rites of passage, a society doesn't know which story it's in. But if we want these processes to work, we have to trust the storyteller or the initiator. And the problem today is that intergenerational conflict is undermining that possibility. Greta's generation is arguing that adults have betrayed them. And some adults are saying that the best thing adults can do is get out of the way of kids. Most notably, it was Harrison Ford yesterday saying it at the UN. I thought, oh Lord, Han Solo is preaching to us. And I think we face a reality. Education about climate change at the moment has been too often characterized by adults, fearful of the world they see coming, telling young people they have to fix it. At the same time, let's think about what we're doing when we initiate young people into the world. What are the sorts of initiations we're offering? And I'd suggest that they are frankly careless in many institutions. This is an image from 1920 hazing ritual in America. When we're introducing students into life on a lively planet, our job is fundamentally not to throw up our hands in despair, not to buy into the story that adults are useless and they should get out of the way, but to take responsibility with students for the world that we're making. Fundamentally, we have to have authority as educators. And authority, as we know, is earned respect. And how do you earn respect? You earn respect by taking responsibility. This is the point of education. And Hannah Arendt puts it better than I ever could. Education, she says, is the point at which we decide whether we love the world enough to assume responsibility for it, and by the same token save it from that ruin, which, except for renewal, except for the coming of the new and young, would be inevitable. And education, too, is where we decide whether we love our children enough not to expel them from our world and leave them to their own devices, nor to strike from their hands their chance of undertaking something new, something unforeseen by us, symbiosis again, but to prepare them in advance for the task of renewing a common world. So can the university become a place of initiation into life on a lively planet? Well, it can if we are able to reconnect with body, land, and place, if we're able to relearn old stories and write new ones, if we're enabled to ensure that we as teachers can renew our responsibility for the world. Whether universities can achieve this, in my view, will determine whether they will continue to have a vital civilizational role in the future, or whether they will simply fade away and become research institutions alongside lots of others. A different university is possible. A university with a living campus. A university where its economics underpins the capacity to rebuild democracy. A university where the education and research programs collide different forms of knowledge. And a university where we're able to build intergenerational relations and initiation processes that really enable our students to find their place alongside other beings and other people in the world. Universities have changed before. They can change again. And if they don't, a cautionary tale. I promised you pirates. Not only do I have pirates, I have women pirates, come on. In the 16th century, the wars with France were over and the British Navy had a huge surplus of sailors. They were treating them very badly, there was no sense of mission. You see what happened? The pirates emerged. Okay? The pirates set up on their own, and they set up on their own with new rules. They set up with new rules of fair distribution of wealth, of listening to women, to black people, to white people in the same place. They inspired democracy. They were working on a democratic basis. They set up a new island that was entirely democratic. And they inspired Thomas Paine and the French Revolution. The rest is history. Universities have been overproducing PhDs for years. There is a growing disconnect in values between universities as institutions and young academics. They are facing more hostile and meaningless requirements and poorer working conditions. Outside the university, new institutions are beckoning, fueled by engaged students, rich knowledge traditions, and really new technologies. What would a pirate university look like? The time, I think, is ripe for an insurgency. In times of civilizational change, universities change. New possibilities open up. If traditional universities won't recognize the need to invent new university, a new form of university for life on a lively planet, others may well do so. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Keri. We have a little bit of time left for some questions. So please just raise your hand if you have one, and I'll come around and bring you the microphone so everyone can hear you.
And if not, we can all just go for a drink. That's also okay. Yeah, is it a good question? Because, I've just put you in between people and, dinner.
I mean, it's a burning question, so let's see if it's any good. Something that I'm interested in very much is the idea of the planet as an alive being.
Yeah.
And I think you touched upon this, and in a way, much of the topics you brought up, they're, to me, circling around this type of idea. However, it's not sort of brought out explicitly, and I think this is often done consciously, and I understand that, and I'm curious as to your perception of if that's something we need to keep doing, if that's something that is conducive to being accessible to everybody, or whether whether we want to rather be vocal about how we, like, say in terms of worldview, what our perception is.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a really good point, and I think this is the underpinning issue around the civilizational shift that I'm talking about, which is, the 20th century was characterized by new definitions of personhood. It was characterized by, I sometimes think, I was trying to tell the story of how universities change, and quite often I feel like saying, well, I'm here, that wouldn't have happened 100 odd years ago. So what the 20th century did was it gradually expanded our ideas of what constituted a person. Women, people of color, people with disabilities. The concept of what counted as being our sense of what a being was that we needed to attend to has expanded. And I think we're seeing that in terms of the development of new relationships with all sorts of other natural beings, bearing in mind that we too ourselves are natural. And I think one of the most important cultural movements that we're seeing at the moment is the Earth Rights movement, which is beginning to say that many other beings on the planet also should be afforded the right of personhood. And I think that idea and that challenge is fundamental, and it requires then different relationships with the world. So I agree with you. This is precisely where I think we are heading. But I think for us to do that in a way that is going to stick, if you like, that isn't going to just be a fad, is it requires that work on the self, and it requires the experience, the encounter with others in order to know that. Because I think it's the sort of thing that you actually know and you feel in your body, rather than something that, a fancy textbook kind of tells you about. Which is precisely why I was suggesting that one of the things that I think we need to do in universities is to think about how we enable young people and ourselves to encounter the world through our bodies, through things such as wilderness quests, although not everybody has to go sit on a mountain for 4 days without food. But there are other ways of doing this. So thank you.
Thank you for a great presentation. I would really like to ask you one, but since I'm supposed to ask you, I ask you, Keri, would you support a student movement? There are climate students here at Uppsala and the other university that basically tells the leadership of this university to say, use your brain, go by train, and just do it, get on with it. When I travel to conferences, I go by train. You do it, Kevin Anderson did it. It's very simple. It's just get on with it. Do the decision. When we, as students of this university, go for conferences, we go by train. It's that simple.
Can I just say, I think it's great, but what I really worry about with this debate is that that's where it stops. Okay, so the point I've been trying to make is that we've got immediate actions we need to take, and they're at all levels of the university. And I think, but fundamentally, there are many, many different levels that are associated with this shift. So I would absolutely support all of the actions that we need to take in terms of carbon reduction, carbon emissions reduction. But I also want us not to get hooked on that being the way in which we fix everything. We need fundamentally to develop a different relationship with the planet and with the beings that are part of the planet. And that involves relations of care, relations of stewardship, the ignored work of maintenance. All of those things are essential. So of course I back those calls. But what I want us to do, particularly the climate students and others, is to say, well, what else do we need to do as we're making this shift?
Thank you very much, Keri. I had a question about financing. A lot of the university is financed by business, and so a lot of the research seems to be quite towards certain ideas of what's valuable. So how can the university sort of shift unless society and governance and business does at the same time? How does it relate to outside?
I thought you were my friend.
Sorry.
Yeah, universities don't live in a bubble. But actually, the conversation that we had earlier this evening suggests that, there are alliances to be made. I think we need to start playing very, very seriously with the economic models that we have available to us. And actually, it's quite clear that state actors remain significant. So most of the funding for most of the universities in Europe, and that's why I've talked about the European University, still comes from the state or comes from students. So actually, I think that is the main point of conversation. And those states are continuing to fund blue skies research, and they are continuing to fund new approaches. I actually don't think it's the funding models. I think there is a fundamental question about how we decide new research questions in disciplines. And for a very long time, the people that we think we are accountable to are the other people in our discipline. So the people that we want to impress are the other senior scholars. We want the great paper, we want these 3 other people who really know our area, to think that we're really good. And that, I think, is actually as much of a block on anything, on really trying to address and to experiment with new ways of working as anything else. And that's why understanding where disciplines come from really matters. So for me, actually, the trick, and we succeeded in this in the UK with the Connected Communities programme, was to point out to scholars and colleagues that working in partnership with communities of various different sorts generates seriously interesting ideas, seriously interesting research questions that can transform a field. And that's where I think we really, really need to work, is supporting us to kind of lift our heads a little bit and see where the possibility might be for exciting new research agendas. And to do that, we need to take some risks. And that's where university leadership can really help, because university leadership can say to younger researchers in particular, don't worry, your job is not to make Professor Blogs over here happy. Your job is to open up new areas of inquiry, to build new relationships, to generate, transformative research. But university leaders need to create a protective space for young researchers so that they feel confident to do that. Otherwise, they get sucked into a machine of simply thinking it is about journal publications and the 3 other people that are going to read them.
Question on knowledge and in a way the challenge, if I understand you correctly or think about it myself, is that the university as a guardian of knowledge and knowledge development in a world where it seems that the idea of knowledge is also slipping. So we have a lot of talk about fake news. Everybody knows their own specialist.
Mm-hmm.
How could you comment on the challenge of the new university that you seem to be saying that we really need to decommission some of our disciplines in order to get some more job done? But
so in relation to the post-truth and a fact world, I mean, you're talking to somebody whose country is currently being destroyed by that particular situation, and it's being destroyed by the intervention of Cambridge Analytica and amongst others into our popular consciousness. So the thing that I think, what I can see from that situation is that what we have is massive polarization. And that's why I mentioned the Gilets jaunes and the Extinction Rebellion at the beginning, because these also are 2 sides potentially against each other. And what we need to do, if we're not simply to polarize, and I think there's a huge risk of this, particularly in the climate change debate, is that we're going to start really dividing population, is that we need to shift from an online space actually back to some really old traditions of face-to-face conversation that are about collective, popular, bottom-up democracy, where people can learn to talk to people that they're previously scared of. Because what we have is the production of fear of other people. Danielle Allen has written a wonderful book, and her argument is that we need to shift towards creating conditions where we treat each other as friends. Now, if you're going to learn to treat each other as friends, you need to create spaces of encounter. So one of the things that we're going to be doing over the next year is trying to create spaces for different sorts of democracy in Uppsala that are not just reliant on representative democracy. Once a year you vote, then you forget about it, then you complain, which, you know, it's really not a great model. But nor are they based on social media kind of shouting. So we're looking at understanding what's going on with citizens' assemblies that are spaces for collective decision-making, and we will be working with civil society, with the region, with the commune, with local industry, with the arts community, to try to create public spaces for people to get to know each other. Because the thing that is happening with Cambridge Analytica, the thing that is happening with the online spaces, is that people are getting fundamentally different information. And if people are getting fundamentally different information, they may be making rational decisions on the basis of the information that they've got. So they then look at somebody else who's making a different decision and thinks that they're idiots. This is not a good basis for a conversation. So we have to find ways to pull people out of that. And I think, again, the university has the potential. Universities are public organizations that have the potential to act as a platform for hosting and enabling this sort of conversation. But to me, this is a long game. Rebuilding democracy, rethinking economics, restoring climate is both urgent and a very long game. And we have to start putting in place the actions that will rebuild it slowly.
I had a question about your idea of symbiosis, and I was curious about how you saw that as being different from existing approaches of interdisciplinarity and transdisciplinarity, and perhaps why you thought those hadn't been as successful as they would have liked to be.
So there's lots of different models of interdisciplinarity, transdisciplinarity, and so forth, and most of them are designed for, you know, European Union funding proposals. I will demonstrate I'm being interdisciplinary. There's problems with them. So on one level, you get models of interdisciplinarity that is, the sciences will introduce the arts, and the arts gets brought in to communicate the science, okay? Not particularly productive. Or you get a kind of synthetic model where you stick these things together, and somehow that's supposed to create a new whole. But the model I'm thinking of with symbiosis is closest to what Andrew Barry calls agonistic interdisciplinarity, which I just think is overly complicated as a phrase. But his point is you come together from a position of absence. You come together because you know there's something missing in your way of dealing with the world, in the tools that you have. And I think that's the critical point, is knowing that it is not about coming from a position of kind of, you know, my discipline, you know, above all others, but from a position of vulnerability. So that's really where I am with it. I think that's probably enough. It's a really, thank you for the question. It's a long and complicated thing, and you're right to put your finger on it, and it's right for us to kind of continue to niggle at that and work out really what it looks like. Thank you.
I think we're about out of time now. Thanks for your great questions, and thank you again, Keri. If you're interested in following the work that we'll be doing over the next year, you can find our website through the Uppsala University homepage by searching for Climate Change Leadership Node. And if you want to get your hands on some fantastic text, Keri has written a text for this inaugural lecture, and you're very welcome to have a copy of it to take home for yourself. So please join me one more time in thanking Keri for this really inspiring lecture.